Neighbor ruined my fence and claimed I did it. Said you'll never prove it. I set up cameras, caught him repainting it to hide the damage, and took him to court. He's now paying me monthly. I moved to Ann Arbor for peace, not for chaos. After my divorce from Neil, I wanted a quiet life, a small house, a small yard, maybe even a garden. Nothing extravagant, just something to call my own, where I could finally breathe and not worry about being criticized for every little thing I did. And that's exactly what I thought I was getting when I bought this modest ranch-style house in a sleepy suburb. 2 days after moving in, as I was trying to plant some lavender along the fence, I met Neville Borowski, my neighbor. I noticed him first when his shadow loomed over my shoulder. "Planning on doing some landscaping, are you?" he said, his tone friendly but eyes sharp. I looked up, brushing dirt off my hands. Yeah. Just planting some flowers." "Lavender, right?" he asked, nodding like he approved but then furrowing his brows. "They can attract bees, you know. And if it spreads over to my side, I'll need you to manage it. Don't want my property invaded, you understand?" "Of course," I replied, a bit taken aback. I'd barely been there a week, and already he was setting boundaries I hadn't even crossed. "I'll keep it trimmed." "Good," he said, lingering for a beat too long before finally walking back to his own yard. I thought that would be the end of it, but Neville was one of those people who never quite knew when to quit. The following Saturday, as I was hammering in the last nails on a new picket fence I'd built along my yard for a bit of privacy, Neville appeared again, this time with a clipboard. He watched me work for a moment, pursing his lips like he was sizing me up. Finally, he cleared his throat and said, "Poppy, was it?" "Yup," I said, giving him a nod but trying to keep my focus on the fence, hoping he'd get the hint and leave me alone. He didn't. "You know," he began, tapping his clipboard, "there are neighborhood guidelines for fencing. And, well, that fence of yours isn't quite aligned." I looked at him, confused. "Aligned?" Yes. "See," he pointed to a few inches where my fence and his didn't line up perfectly. "Your fence should technically be right in line with mine. It's these small details that keep our neighborhood looking uniform." I didn't know what to say. I'd just spent an entire weekend on this fence, not to mention the money I'd shelled out for the lumber. "Neville," I said, trying to keep my voice steady, "it's only off by an inch or so. And it's on my property. An inch or two might not mean much to you, but we all agreed when we moved here to follow certain standards," he replied, waving his clipboard as if it held some sacred document. "It keeps property values high, keeps things looking respectable. I'm just trying to be neighborly here." "Right," I replied through gritted teeth. "Well, thanks for the advice. But I think I'll keep it as it is." Neville narrowed his eyes. "Suit yourself. Just remember, this isn't the kind of neighborhood where we cut corners." It took every ounce of patience I had to hold back the words I wanted to say. But I forced a smile, nodded, and watched him go. I was fuming. Yet, I reminded myself that sometimes it was better to avoid conflict. My sister Griselda was always reminding me, "Poppy, not every fight is worth the trouble." She'd repeated that advice so many times it was practically burned into my brain. A month or so passed, and things were relatively quiet with Neville, until the morning I went out to water my plants and noticed a long crack down the middle of one of my fence panels. I muttered to myself, running my fingers along the splintered wood. It didn't make sense. I hadn't hit it with anything, and we hadn't had any storms or high winds lately. I shrugged it off, figuring it might just be a fluke, and went about my day. But then, a week later, I noticed another crack, this time on a different panel. And 2 days after that, yet another one. I inspected each one carefully, noticing they all had the same pattern, a clean break in the middle as if someone had hit them with something blunt. That night, I vented to Griselda over the phone. "Poppy, it's probably nothing," she said, her voice calm and practical as always. "Maybe the wood's just not good quality. Could be expansion from the heat." "I thought of that," I replied, pacing my living room. "But they're all in the same place, Gree. And Neville's been weird about the fence since day one." "Oh, that man sounds like a pill," she sighed. "Honestly, why don't you just move somewhere else?" "Because I can't just pick up and leave every time I run into a difficult person," I snapped, then softened, knowing she was only trying to help. "Besides, I really like it here. I just need to deal with him." "Okay," she said slowly. "Just try not to stir the pot too much. You know how you get, Poppy. You're stubborn when you feel like someone's out to get you." "Yeah, but I'm not crazy, Gree. I know he's messing with my fence." The next night, I stayed up late, determined to catch him in the act. I kept the lights off in my living room and sat by the window, watching the yard. Hours passed, and I was just about to give up when I saw it, Neville, creeping over in the darkness, holding what looked like a crowbar. My heart pounded as he leaned over my fence and struck one of the panels with a quick, precise jab. I couldn't believe my eyes. The following morning, as he was watering his roses, I marched over. "Neville, I called out, trying to keep my voice steady. I saw you last night, hitting my fence. I don't understand why you'd do that. He turned to me, his expression blank at first, and then he let out a slow, patronizing laugh. Poppy, he said, shaking his head, you must be mistaken. Maybe you were dreaming. And anyway, if your fence has damage, it's on your side. Not my problem. But I saw you, Neville. Why are you lying about this? I was almost shouting now, the frustration boiling over. He just shrugged, an infuriating smile tugging at his lips. You'll never prove it, he said, his voice so low it was almost a whisper. But if you want to go around making wild accusations, be my guest. That night, I installed a security camera. I was done being walked over, done letting people take advantage of my patience. Griselda called me later, asking how things were, and I filled her in. Oh, Poppy, she groaned, are you sure this is worth it? The man sounds deranged. I just don't want you to get in over your head. It's not just about the fence, I replied, gripping the phone tighter. It's about standing up for myself. I'm tired of letting people like Neville get away with things just because it's easier. There was a pause, and then Griselda sighed. Well, all right. But if things escalate, I want you to call me right away. Don't try to handle everything alone. I promise, I said, feeling a wave of relief wash over me. Griselda could be tough on me, but I knew she had my back. That night, I barely slept. I kept an eye on the security footage, but nothing happened. Then, 2 nights later, I finally caught him. Neville crept into my yard around midnight, a bucket of white paint and a brush in hand. I watched as he began slathering the paint over the cracks he'd created, humming softly to himself like he was painting a masterpiece. It was so surreal, watching him meticulously cover up the damage he'd done, all while acting as if he was the innocent one. I saved the footage and couldn't wait to confront him. But I wanted to play it smart. The next morning, I called Griselda to fill her in on what I'd caught on camera. He was out there with a paintbrush, Griselda. He's covering up the cracks he made. Can you believe it? I practically whispered, still high on the adrenaline of catching him red-handed. Griselda laughed, but it was a nervous laugh. That man is a piece of work, I'll give you that. But, Poppy, what are you going to do with the footage? Are you sure you want to take this further? Oh, you bet I am, I replied. He told me I'd never prove it, so I'm going to prove it. I'm tired of letting people push me around. I wasn't entirely sure what my next steps would be, but I knew that if I didn't act, Neville would keep escalating. He was the type who fed on control, and he'd mistaken my kindness for weakness. For once, I felt powerful in my decision to stand up for myself. So, I took the footage, downloaded a couple of copies, and made an appointment with an attorney. The lawyer, a serious, no-nonsense woman named Barbara, watched the footage and gave me a nod of approval. This is pretty clear-cut evidence of property damage and harassment, Poppy, Barbara said, tapping her pen against her legal pad. We can file a restraining order and take him to small claims court to recover damages for the fence. And if you're feeling up for it, I'd recommend you also request a neighborhood mediation hearing. He sounds like the type who won't take well to being publicly reprimanded. Just hearing her lay out the plan gave me a sense of validation. Neville was about to learn that I wasn't the pushover he thought I was. A week later, I served Neville with the court papers. He tried to act nonchalant, but I saw the color drain from his face. And for once, he didn't have a smug remark, he simply stared at the paper, then glared at me. You're making a big mistake, Poppy, he spat, his voice tight with anger. You don't know who you're dealing with. Oh, I know exactly who I'm dealing with, Neville, I replied, smiling sweetly. I just don't think you know who you're dealing with. It didn't take long for word of the court case to spread through the neighborhood, and to say that people were interested would be an understatement. Neville had apparently earned a bit of a reputation over the years, petty complaints, nitpicking, and bossing around anyone who dared not follow his guidelines. I'd just become his most recent target, but I was the first one willing to stand up to him. The court hearing was surprisingly quick. Barbara presented the footage, and Neville didn't stand a chance. The judge ordered him to pay for the damages, including the costs of repainting and fixing every cracked panel. He was furious, hissing under his breath about ridiculous court rulings and how this was completely unfair. As I left the courthouse, I thought that might be the end of it. But Neville wasn't finished with me yet. He went quiet for about a week, and I almost started to relax, thinking maybe he'd finally backed off. But one evening, I came home to find my yard littered with trash, bags of leaves, empty beer cans, and a pile of rotting vegetables. That was the last straw. I called the police to report the vandalism, and since Neville was the prime suspect in an ongoing dispute, they took it seriously. But I decided it was time to hit him where it hurt the most, his reputation. The next morning, I posted an anonymous notice in the neighborhood's online group, detailing the harassment I'd endured from a certain neighbor, hinting at Neville's antics without naming him. And I wasn't the only one who had grievances. The post blew up, with comment after comment from other neighbors sharing their own stories about Neville's demands, his clipboard inspections, and his general condescending attitude. The best part? My post caught the eye of a local journalist who happened to live in the area. She messaged me privately, asking if I'd be willing to go on record about Neville's harassment. "You know, it's not every day that a story like this comes up," she said on the phone. "The way he's terrorized the neighborhood with these so-called guidelines, it might be worth exposing." I hesitated at first, worried it might be too drastic. But then I thought of all the times he'd tried to intimidate me, the smug way he'd sneered and told me, "You'll never prove it." This wasn't just for me, it was for everyone in the neighborhood who'd put up with his behavior for years. The article came out a couple of weeks later. It wasn't a scathing expose, but it painted a clear picture of a tyrant in a quiet suburb, a man who'd taken it upon himself to enforce his own rules with intimidation tactics and manipulative behavior. The article didn't use his name, but anyone in the neighborhood could put two and two together. After the article circulated, things started to change for Neville. People avoided him at neighborhood events, and he was no longer invited to the monthly homeowners' meetings he'd once led with an iron fist. His reputation was in tatters, and the scorn he'd inflicted on others came back to him tenfold. I thought that would be enough to finally put things to rest, but Neville's humiliation only seemed to make him angrier. One night, I heard a loud crash outside and saw him storming around his yard, knocking over his own flower pots, muttering angrily to himself. He was unraveling, and while I felt a pang of pity, I reminded myself of everything he'd put me and the neighbors through. Then came the final blow. I'd been keeping in touch with a neighbor, who informed me that she'd overheard Neville's wife arguing with him. Apparently, she'd had enough of his pettiness and his obsession with control. That night, she packed her bags, loaded up the car, and drove off, leaving him standing alone in the driveway. And that's when I realized my revenge had come full circle. I didn't need to confront him or even lift a finger anymore, he'd dug his own grave. I just handed him the shovel. His own actions and arrogance had alienated everyone around him, leaving him isolated and bitter in the home he'd once controlled. Every now and then, I still catch a glimpse of him from my kitchen window, wandering his yard with a lost look, his empire of order reduced to nothing but empty flower pots and a battered clipboard. For once, I feel a quiet, satisfying peace in my little house, knowing that Neville, for all his self-assurance, had finally met his match.